The morning sun cast long shadows across the stone corridors of Windsor Castle as Prince William hurried toward his father's private study. His footsteps echoed against the ancient walls, each step carrying the weight of unspoken worry that had been building for weeks. The urgent phone call from his father's private secretary had come at dawn, requesting an immediate meeting. Something in the man's voice had sent a chill down William's spine. William paused outside the heavy oak door, straightening his tie and taking a deep breath. The familiar scent of leather books and his father's favorite cologne drifted through the gaps around the doorframe. He knocked gently, hearing the familiar voice call him in. King Charles sat behind his massive mahogany desk, papers scattered before him, but his attention was focused entirely on his eldest son as he entered. The king looked older than William remembered, his face bearing new lines of fatigue and something else that William couldn't quite identify. There was a heaviness in his father's eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and difficult decisions. Charles gestured to the chair across from his desk, the same chair where William had sat countless times as a child, listening to stories and receiving gentle guidance about his future responsibilities. "Thank you for coming so quickly," Charles began, his voice carrying a tremor that was unlike his usual confident tone. "Please sit down. We need to talk about something very important." William settled into the chair, noticing how his father's hands trembled slightly as he reached for a sealed envelope on his desk. The envelope was cream-colored, heavy paper that bore the royal seal. But there was something different about it, something more personal than the usual official documents. William studied his father's face, searching for clues about what could be troubling him so deeply. "Father, you're starting to worry me. What's going on?" The concern in his voice was evident, reflecting the close relationship they had built over the years, especially since his mother's death had brought them closer together in their shared grief and responsibility. Charles leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming nervously on the desk surface. "William, I've been doing a great deal of thinking lately about our family, about the monarchy, and about what truly matters in life." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts carefully. "As king, I've always tried to balance duty with personal happiness, but I've come to realize that there are some things more important than tradition and protocol." The weight of his father's words settled over William like a heavy blanket. He had grown up understanding that duty came before personal desires, that the crown required sacrifices that ordinary people never had to make. Yet something in his father's tone suggested that this conversation was about to challenge everything he thought he knew about their roles and responsibilities. "I've made a decision," Charles continued, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "A decision that I know will surprise you, perhaps even shock you, but it's something I feel I must do." He picked up the envelope again, turning it over in his hands as if weighing its contents against his conscience. "This decision affects not just me, but you, Catherine, the children, and the entire royal family." William felt his heart rate increase, 1,000 possibilities racing through his mind. Was his father ill? Was there some scandal brewing that he hadn't heard about? The serious expression on Charles's face suggested that whatever was coming would change their lives in ways he couldn't yet imagine. "Father, please, just tell me what's happening. Whatever it is, we'll face it together." The king smiled sadly at his son's words, remembering all the times he had offered similar support to his own parents during difficult moments. "You remind me so much of your mother when you say things like that," he said softly. "She always believed that love and family should come first, even when duty demanded otherwise." The mention of Diana brought a familiar ache to both their hearts, a reminder of the woman who had shaped their understanding of what it meant to serve others. Charles stood up from his desk and walked to the large window overlooking the castle grounds. The gardens were in full bloom, a riot of colors that Diana had loved to see each spring. "I've been thinking about what she would want for our family, what she would advise me to do in this situation." He turned back to face William, the envelope still clutched in his hands. "And I believe I know what that would be. Your mother always said that the most important thing we could give our children was the freedom to choose their own happiness," Charles continued, his voice growing emotional. "She worried that the weight of the crown would crush the joy out of your life, just as it had done to so many of our ancestors." William felt a lump forming in his throat as he remembered his mother's gentle words of encouragement, her constant reminders that he was loved for who he was, not just for his title. The king returned to his desk and placed the envelope directly in front of William. Inside this envelope is something that will change everything for you and your family. It's my final wish as your father, though I pray it won't be final for many years to come." His hands shook slightly as he pushed the envelope across the polished surface. "But before you open it, I need you to understand why I've made this choice." William stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it, afraid of what it might contain. The morning had started like any other, with coffee and newspapers and plans for a normal day of royal duties. Now he sat facing a decision that his father clearly believed would alter the course of their lives forever. The silence stretched between them, filled with years of love, duty, and the unspoken understanding that their family was different from all others. "I love you, William," Charles said quietly. "Everything I've done, everything I'm about to ask of you, comes from that love and from my deep respect for the man you've become." The sincerity in his father's voice was unmistakable, but it only made William more anxious about what revelation awaited him in the sealed envelope that sat before him like a door to an unknown future. William's hands trembled as he reached for the envelope, his mind racing with possibilities about what his father's final wish could contain. The heavy paper felt warm against his fingers, as if it had absorbed all the emotion and careful consideration that had gone into its creation. He looked up at his father one more time, searching for any hint of what was to come. But Charles simply nodded encouragingly, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and apprehension. Breaking the royal seal felt like crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. Inside the envelope, William found a single sheet of paper covered in his father's careful handwriting. The words were written in the same elegant script that had filled birthday cards and letters throughout his childhood, but the message they contained was unlike anything he could have imagined. As his eyes moved across the lines, William felt the world shift beneath him. The letter began with an expression of love and pride that brought immediate tears to William's eyes. His father wrote about watching him grow from a curious boy into a devoted husband and father, praising his dedication to duty and his genuine care for the people they served. But then the tone shifted, and Charles revealed the true purpose of his message. He was considering stepping down from the throne, not due to illness or scandal, but because he wanted to give William something precious, the choice to live his own life. "My dear son," the letter continued, "I have watched you carry the weight of expectation with grace and dignity, but I have also seen the moments when that weight becomes almost unbearable. I remember the look in your eyes when George asked why he couldn't have normal playdates like other children, and when Charlotte wondered why photographers always followed your family wherever you went. These moments have haunted me because they remind me of my own childhood struggles with the demands of royal life." William had to pause in his reading, overwhelmed by the accuracy of his father's observations. Those moments with his children had indeed been difficult, trying to explain why their lives were so different from their friends while maintaining their innocence and joy. He had often wondered if he was doing enough to protect them from the harsh realities of public scrutiny. Just as his mother had tried to protect him and Harry, the letter went on to explain Charles's reasoning in greater detail. "I have come to believe that the monarchy can only survive if it evolves with the times, and part of that evolution means allowing future kings to choose their path freely. I want to give you what no heir to the throne has ever had, the genuine option to walk away if that would make you and your family happier." The words hit William like a physical blow, not because they were harsh, but because they revealed the depth of his father's sacrifice. Charles had thought through every aspect of this decision, the letter revealed. He had consulted constitutional experts, spoken with the Archbishop of Canterbury, and even reached out quietly to Commonwealth leaders to gauge their reactions. The conclusion he had reached was that the monarchy would be stronger if it was led by someone who chose to serve rather than someone who felt trapped by birthright and tradition. "I know this puts an enormous burden on you," the handwritten words continued, "but I believe it's a different kind of burden than the one you've carried all your life. This is the burden of choice, of having to decide what kind of life you want for yourself and your children. I pray that you will choose to continue our family's service to the nation, but I want that choice to come from your heart, not from obligation alone." William looked up from the letter to find his father watching him intently, trying to read his reaction. The king's face showed the strain of keeping this momentous secret, the weight of making such a radical decision alone. "Father," William began, his voice cracking with emotion, "I don't know what to say. This is He struggled to find words adequate to express the mix of gratitude, fear, and overwhelming love that filled his chest. "You don't have to say anything right now," Charles replied gently. "This isn't a decision that needs to be made today or even this year. I wanted you to know what I'm thinking, what I'm prepared to do, so that you can consider your own feelings without the pressure of immediate crisis." The thoughtfulness of this approach was so characteristic of his father, always trying to protect his children even when making the most difficult decisions. The letter concluded with a paragraph that would stay with William for the rest of his life. "Whatever you decide, know that I am proud of you beyond words. If you choose to accept the crown, you will do so with my complete confidence and support. If you choose a different path, you will do so with my complete understanding and blessing. The greatest gift I can give you is the freedom to choose your own happiness, just as your mother would have wanted." William folded the letter carefully, his hand still shaking from the magnitude of what he had just read. The silence in the study was profound, filled with the weight of tradition and the possibility of revolutionary change. Outside the window, life at Windsor Castle continued as it had for centuries, but inside this room everything had shifted. The future that William had accepted as inevitable was now just one of several possibilities. "How long have you been thinking about this?" William asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. The question seemed inadequate given the enormity of what his father was proposing, but it was all he could manage in the moment. Charles smiled sadly, recognizing the shock and confusion in his son's expression as a mirror of his own feelings when the idea had first occurred to him. "Longer than I care to admit," Charles answered honestly. "It started as a small thought after George's last birthday party, when I saw how much he enjoyed just being a normal child with his friends. Then it grew stronger after each public engagement where I watched you struggle to balance being a father with being a future king." The admission revealed just how closely Charles had been observing his son's inner conflict, how much he understood the challenges that William faced daily. The two men sat in contemplative silence, both overwhelmed by the implications of this conversation. William realized that his father wasn't just offering him a choice about his future. He was offering to sacrifice his own sense of duty and tradition for his son's happiness. The magnitude of that love and sacrifice was almost too much to comprehend, and William felt tears beginning to form in his eyes as the full impact of his father's gift began to sink in. William drove home to Kensington Palace in a daze, his father's letter safely tucked in his jacket pocket, its weight seeming to press against his chest with every heartbeat. The familiar streets of London blurred past his window as his protection officers navigated through the afternoon traffic, but William saw none of it. His mind was completely consumed by the choice his father had laid before him, a choice that seemed both liberating and terrifying in equal measure. When he arrived home, Catherine was in the garden with the children, her laughter mixing with George's excited shouts as he chased a football across the manicured lawn. Charlotte was picking flowers nearby, creating a small bouquet with the careful concentration that she brought to all her activities. Louis was toddling around the garden borders, occasionally stopping to examine interesting stones or leaves that caught his attention. The scene was so perfectly normal, so beautifully ordinary that William felt his chest tighten with emotion. Catherine looked up as he approached, her smile immediately fading when she saw his expression. After years of marriage, she could read his moods better than anyone, and something in his face told her that this afternoon had brought news that would change their lives. "Children, why don't you continue playing while Daddy and I have a quick chat?" she suggested, her voice maintaining its cheerful tone despite the concern in her eyes. William found himself unable to speak as they walked toward a secluded corner of the garden, away from little ears that might overhear their conversation. Catherine waited patiently, her hand slipping into his, offering silent support while he gathered his thoughts. Finally, he pulled out the letter and handed it to her without explanation, watching as her expression shifted from curiosity to shock to something that looked like relief mixed with fear. "Oh, William," she whispered after reading the letter twice, her free hand coming up to cover her mouth. "Your father is offering us something incredible, but also something that could change everything we've ever known." She understood immediately the magnitude of the choice before them, the weight of deciding not just their own future but the future of their children and the monarchy itself. They sat together on a garden bench, watching their children play, each lost in their own thoughts about what this choice could mean. Catherine had grown up knowing she would marry into the royal family, accepting the responsibilities and restrictions that would come with that life. But she had also witnessed firsthand the toll that constant public scrutiny could take, especially on the children who had no choice in the matter. "What are you thinking?" William asked softly, desperately needing to hear her perspective on this impossible decision. Catherine was quiet for a long moment, her eyes following George as he practiced his football skills, completely unaware that his future might be about to change dramatically. "I'm thinking about George," she admitted finally. "About the conversation we had last week when he asked why he couldn't go to his friend's birthday party because of security concerns. I'm thinking about Charlotte asking why she can't have sleepovers like other girls her age. I'm thinking about Louis growing up never knowing what it feels like to walk down a street without bodyguards." Her voice carried a mixture of sadness and protective maternal instinct. William felt his heart break a little at her words because they echoed his own deepest concerns. "But I'm also thinking about all the good we could do," Catherine continued. "About the charities we support, the causes we champion, the way we can use our platform to help people who need it most. I'm thinking about the visits to hospitals where we see children light up just because we took the time to meet them. The complexity of their situation was overwhelming. Walking away would mean freedom for their family, the chance to raise their children with privacy and normalcy. But it would also mean abandoning the opportunity to serve their country in a unique and meaningful way, giving up the platform they had used to advocate for mental health awareness, environmental protection, and support for veterans and their families. Your father is giving us something that no royal couple has ever had," Catherine said, taking his hand and squeezing it gently. "The genuine choice to decide our own fate. But that also means we bear the responsibility for whatever decision we make." She turned to look at him directly, her eyes filled with love and understanding. "Whatever we choose together." That evening, after the children were bathed and tucked into bed, William and Catherine found themselves walking through the palace corridors, their footsteps echoing in the quiet spaces that had housed generations of their family. They passed portraits of ancestors who had never had choices, who had accepted duty as their only option. The weight of history seemed to press down on them from every direction. "I keep thinking about my mother," William confided as they paused in front of a painting of Diana. "About how she always said that the most important thing was our happiness, but also about how much she believed in using our position to help others." The memory of his mother's passionate advocacy for landmine victims, AIDS patients, and homeless youth reminded him of the unique power that came with royal status. Catherine nodded, understanding the conflict between personal happiness and public service that had torn at Diana's heart throughout her life. "She would want us to choose love," Catherine said softly. "But I think she would also want us to choose wisely, considering not just our own happiness but the happiness of everyone our decision would affect." They spent hours talking that night, exploring every angle of the choice before them. They discussed how their children might feel years from now if they learned their parents had walked away from their heritage. They also talked about how those same children might feel if they grew up feeling trapped by expectations they never chose. The conversation was exhausting and emotional, but it was also bringing them closer together as they faced the biggest decision of their lives. "I need to talk to Harry," William said suddenly, realizing that his brother's perspective would be invaluable. Harry had walked away from royal duties, choosing love and freedom over tradition and obligation. But he had also faced intense criticism and public backlash for that choice. His experience could provide crucial insight into what life might look like on the other side of royal responsibility. Catherine agreed immediately, knowing that this decision was too important to make without consulting family members who understood the unique pressures they faced. "And I think we should talk to your grandmother," she added, referring to the Queen Mother's legacy and wisdom that still influenced royal decisions. Not necessarily about the specifics, but about what she would have valued most, duty or happiness. As they finally prepared for bed, both William and Catherine felt the weight of the choice settling over them like a heavy blanket. Tomorrow would bring new considerations, new conversations, and new emotions as they worked through the most important decision of their lives. But tonight, they held each other close, grateful for the love that would guide them through whatever choice they ultimately made, and overwhelmed by a father's incredible gift of freedom. that had changed everything they thought they knew about their future. 3 days after receiving his father's letter, William found himself on a private plane to California, his heart heavy with the weight of the decision he needed to make. Harry had agreed to meet him immediately when William called, understanding from his brother's voice that something monumentous was happening. The flight gave William hours to think, staring out at the clouds below while wrestling with thoughts that seemed to change with every passing mile. When William arrived at Harry and Meghan's home in Montecito, he was struck by how relaxed and genuinely happy his brother looked. There was a lightness in Harry's eyes that William hadn't seen in years, a peace that seemed to radiate from deep within. The contrast was stark compared to the tension and constant vigilance that characterized royal life back in England, and it made William wonder what he himself might look like with that same freedom. "You look terrible," Harry said with characteristic bluntness as he embraced his brother, but there was deep concern in his voice. "What's happened? Is everyone all right?" The brothers had been through so much together, from their mother's death to their own very public falling out, but family emergencies still brought out their protective instincts toward each other. They walked to a quiet corner of Harry's garden, away from the house where Meghan was entertaining Archie and Lilibet. William pulled out their father's letter with hands that still trembled slightly, watching as Harry's expression shifted from confusion to amazement to something that looked like relief mixed with worry. The silence stretched between them as Harry read and reread the letter, clearly struggling to process the magnitude of what their father was proposing. "My God, William," Harry finally whispered, looking up from the letter with wide eyes. "He's actually offering to let you choose. Do you understand how revolutionary this is? How completely it goes against everything we were taught about duty and service?" There was a mixture of awe and concern in his voice, as someone who understood better than anyone the weight of walking away from royal expectations. William nodded, feeling the emotions of the past few days threatening to overwhelm him again. "I keep going back and forth," he admitted. "One moment I think about the freedom it would give our children, the chance to live normal lives. The next moment I think about abandoning everything our family has stood for, disappointing millions of people who look to the monarchy for stability and service." Harry was quiet for a long time, his eyes distant as he considered his brother's dilemma. His own decision to step back from royal duties had been driven by different circumstances, but he understood the fundamental conflict between personal happiness and public obligation. "Can I tell you something?" Harry said finally. "Walking away was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the most liberating. For the first time in my life, I get to wake up every morning and choose how to spend my day based on what feels right to me and my family." "But do you ever regret it?" William asked, needing to understand if his brother had found peace with his choice or if he still struggled with guilt and doubt. The question hung in the air between them, heavy with years of shared experience and the pain of their public separation from each other. Harry considered the question carefully, clearly wanting to give his brother the most honest answer possible. "I regret the way it happened," he said slowly. "I regret the pain it caused, Dad, the way it divided our family, the public nature of all the conflict. But I don't regret choosing to put my wife and children first. I don't regret choosing to live authentically instead of performing a role that was slowly destroying me." They talked for hours as the California sun set behind the mountains, sharing stories and memories that helped William understand his brother's perspective more fully. Harry spoke about the relief he felt when he realized he could protect his children from the intensity of royal scrutiny, how peaceful it was to make decisions based on family needs rather than public expectations. But he also acknowledged the loneliness of leaving behind a life of service and the guilt that sometimes crept in when he thought about the work he was no longer doing. "The difference is," Harry said as their conversation deepened, "you wouldn't be running away from something. You would be making a conscious choice with Dad's blessing and support. You wouldn't have to burn bridges or fight with the family. You could potentially walk away with dignity and love intact." The distinction was important, highlighting how different William's situation was from the circumstances that had driven Harry's departure. "But what about the people we serve?" William asked, voicing one of his deepest concerns. "The veterans, the homeless, the children in hospitals who light up when we visit them? How do I justify abandoning that responsibility for my own happiness?" The question revealed the core of William's struggle, the conflict between personal fulfillment and service to others that had defined royal duty for generations. Harry leaned forward, his expression serious and compassionate. "You're not abandoning anything, William. You're making a choice about how to use your life to help others. Whether you do it with a crown or without one, you'll still be someone who cares deeply about making the world better. The platform might be different, but the heart behind it will be the same." His words carried the wisdom of someone who had struggled with similar questions and found his own answers. As the evening wore on, William felt some of the weight lifting from his shoulders. Not because the decision had become easier, but because he was beginning to understand that there might not be a wrong choice. Both paths, staying or leaving, carried their own possibilities for good and their own potential for regret. The key was choosing with intention and love rather than fear and obligation. "I think Dad is giving you something incredible," Harry said as they prepared to go back to the house. Not just the choice itself, but the chance to make that choice from a place of love rather than desperation. "Whatever you decide, you'll be doing it with his support and Catherine's love. That's more than most people get when they face life-changing decisions." That night, as William lay in the guest room thinking about his conversation with Harry, he felt a strange sense of peace beginning to settle over him. The choice was still overwhelming, still fraught with implications he couldn't fully understand. But he was beginning to realize that his father's gift wasn't just about freedom from duty. It was about the freedom to choose duty consciously, with full understanding of what it meant and what it cost. The next morning, as he prepared to fly back to London, William felt ready to have deeper conversations with Catherine about their future. Harry's perspective had helped him understand that walking away from royal duty didn't mean walking away from service itself, but it had also helped him realize that choosing to stay could be just as meaningful if it was a genuine choice rather than an obligation imposed by birth. The decision was still ahead of him, but for the first time since receiving his father's letter, William felt hopeful that whatever choice they made would be the right one for their family. William returned from California with a renewed sense of clarity, but also with an unexpected request from Harry that weighed heavily on his mind. His brother had asked him to consider what their mother would have truly wanted, not just for their happiness, but for the institution she had both served and struggled with during her lifetime. This perspective added another layer of complexity to an already overwhelming decision, but it also provided a framework for thinking about the choice that felt more grounded in love than fear. Back at Kensington Palace, William found Catherine in her study, surrounded by research she had been conducting about constitutional law and the history of abdication in European monarchies. She had spent his absence diving deep into understanding the practical implications of his father's offer, wanting to be fully informed about what they would be choosing between. Her dedication to understanding every angle of their situation filled William with even more love and admiration for the woman who had chosen to share this complicated life with him. "I've been thinking about something Harry said," William told her as they settled into their favorite corner of the study, surrounded by the books and papers that had become their tools for working through this decision. "He asked me to consider what Mummy would have wanted, not just for us personally, but for the monarchy itself. I think she would have wanted it to evolve, to become something that could adapt to changing times while still serving its essential purpose." Catherine nodded thoughtfully, having reached similar conclusions in her own research. "I've been reading about how other royal families have handled similar situations," she said, showing him articles about monarchies that had successfully modernized while maintaining their relevance and public support. "What strikes me is that the families who have thrived are the ones who have been willing to change with their societies rather than clinging to traditions that no longer serve anyone." Their conversation was interrupted by George running into the study, his face flushed with excitement from playing football in the garden. "Daddy, when can we go on a normal holiday?" he asked innocently, unaware of how his question pierced his parents' hearts. Tommy's family went to Spain and they just walked around and ate ice cream and nobody took pictures of them. The simplicity of his request highlighted everything that William and Catherine had been struggling with. After gently explaining that they would plan a special family trip soon, they watched George run back to his siblings, his carefree energy a stark reminder of what they were trying to protect. "He doesn't even know what he's asking for," Catherine said softly. "But maybe that's exactly the point. He shouldn't have to think about why his life is different from other children's lives." That evening, William made the difficult decision to call his father and request another meeting. The past week of reflection and conversation had brought him closer to understanding his own feelings. but he needed to understand more about his father's motivations and timeline. Charles agreed immediately, suggesting they meet at Balmoral, where the privacy and tranquility might provide a better setting for such an important discussion. The drive to Scotland gave William more time to process his thoughts, watching the familiar countryside roll past his window as he considered how to express the complexity of his feelings to his father. By the time he arrived at Balmoral, he felt ready for what he suspected would be one of the most important conversations of his life. Charles was waiting for him in the library, a fire crackling in the massive stone fireplace that had warmed countless royal conversations over the decades. The informal setting immediately put William at ease, reminding him of childhood visits when his father would read to him and Harry in this very room. But the gravity of their current discussion was impossible to ignore, even in the comfortable familiarity of this beloved family retreat. "I've been thinking about your letter every day since you gave it to me," William began, settling into the chair across from his father. "And I need to understand something. Are you offering me this choice because you think I want to walk away, or because you believe it's the right thing to do regardless of what I choose?" The question had been nagging at him since their first conversation, a need to understand whether his father's offer came from concern about his happiness or from a broader philosophical shift about the nature of royal service. Charles smiled at his son's directness, recognizing the analytical mind that had always characterized William's approach to difficult problems. "Both," he answered honestly. "I've watched you struggle with the weight of expectation, and it breaks my heart to see you carrying burdens that I carried at your age. But more than that, I've come to believe that the monarchy can only survive if it's led by people who choose to serve, rather than people who feel trapped by obligation." "But what if I choose to stay?" William asked. "What if, after having the freedom to walk away, I decide that this is where I belong, that this is how I can best serve others?" The question revealed the direction his thoughts had been taking, influenced by his conversations with Harry and Catherine, and his own deep reflection on what kind of life would bring him the most fulfillment. "Then you would be the first king in our family's history to reign by choice rather than by birth alone," Charles replied, his voice filled with emotion. "And I believe that would make you stronger, more authentic, and more effective than any of your predecessors." The pride in his father's voice was unmistakable, but so was the genuine respect for whatever decision William might make. They talked late into the night, exploring every aspect of the choice and its implications. Charles shared stories about his own struggles with duty and desire, admitting to moments when he had wondered what his life might have been like if he had been born into a different family. But he also spoke about the deep satisfaction that came from using his position to advocate for causes he cared about, the sense of purpose that royal service had given his life. "The irony," Charles said as their conversation began to wind down, "is that I think offering you this choice might be the most royal thing I've ever done. Not because it follows tradition, but because it puts the needs of our family and our institution above convention and expectation." His words carried the weight of months of careful consideration and the pain of a father watching his child struggle with an impossible situation. As William prepared to leave Balmoral the next morning, he felt a profound shift in his understanding of both his father and himself. The choice was still difficult, still fraught with implications he couldn't fully predict. But he was beginning to understand that the decision itself was less important than the love and intention behind it. Whether he chose to embrace the crown or walk away from it, he would be doing so with his father's blessing and his family's support. The drive back to London was contemplative, filled with thoughts about legacy and love, duty and desire. William realized that his father had given him something even more valuable than choice itself: the knowledge that he was loved unconditionally, that his worth as a son and as a person was not dependent on accepting a role he had never chosen. That knowledge would guide him regardless of what decision he ultimately made, and it filled him with a peace he hadn't felt since this journey began. 2 weeks had passed since William's conversation with his father at Balmoral, and the weight of the decision had begun to settle into something more manageable, though no less significant. He and Catherine had spent countless hours discussing every aspect of their choice, often walking through the gardens of Kensington Palace late at night when the children were asleep, and they could speak freely without little ears nearby. Tonight was different, though. Tonight they had decided to make their decision final. They sat together in their private sitting room, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with family photographs. Pictures of their wedding day, of the children's christenings, of quiet family moments stolen between public engagements filled the space around them. Each image told a story of love and commitment, of a family built with intention despite the extraordinary circumstances of their lives. "I keep coming back to something my grandmother used to say," Catherine said softly, her hand resting in William's as they gazed into the flames. "She always told me that the best decisions are made when you think about who you want to be, not what you want to have." The wisdom of her grandmother's words had been guiding Catherine's thoughts as she worked through the complexity of their situation. William squeezed her hand gently, understanding the depth of what she was saying. "And who do you want to be?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew her answer. Their conversations over the past weeks had revealed a shared understanding of their values and priorities that had only strengthened their bond. "I want to be someone who chooses love over fear," Catherine replied without hesitation. "Someone who makes decisions based on what will create the most good in the world, not what will be easiest or most comfortable." She turned to look at him directly, her eyes reflecting the firelight and something deeper that spoke to the certainty she had found. "And I think that person chooses to stay." William felt his heart both break and heal simultaneously at her words. They perfectly captured what he had been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. "I've been thinking about George," he said quietly, "about the question he asked us about normal holidays. And I realized something. I don't want to give him a normal life. I want to give him a meaningful one." The distinction was important, reflecting a shift in how they understood their role as parents and as public figures. Rather than seeing royal duty as a burden to escape, they were beginning to see it as a platform for teaching their children about service, compassion, and using privilege responsibly. The choice his father had offered had allowed them to see their situation with new clarity. "If we choose this life," Catherine continued, "really choose it rather than just accepting it, we can shape it in ways that honor both our family's needs and our responsibility to others." They had spent considerable time talking about how they could modernize their approach to royal duty, making it more compatible with their values and their children's well-being. William stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the lights of London beyond the palace gates. Somewhere out there were people who looked to the royal family for stability, inspiration, and hope. The responsibility of that was overwhelming, but it was also profoundly meaningful. "I think about the hospital visits," he said, "about the veterans we've met, about the young people who've shared their mental health struggles with us. How do I walk away from the opportunity to help them?" "You don't," Catherine said simply, joining him at the window. "And I don't think your father ever really expected you to. I think he offered you the choice because he knew that only by being free to leave could you truly choose to stay." Her insight into Charles's motivations had developed over their weeks of discussion and reflection. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the city they would serve for the rest of their lives if they made the choice they were both leaning toward. The weight of that commitment was enormous, but so was the potential for positive impact. More importantly, it felt right in a way that neither of them had experienced before having the freedom to choose. "There's something else," William said, pulling an envelope from his jacket pocket. "I wrote a letter to Dad, but I wanted to share it with you first." His hands trembled slightly as he handed it to Catherine, the emotion of putting his decision into words still fresh and overwhelming. Catherine read the letter slowly, tears forming in her eyes as she absorbed William's carefully chosen words. He had written about gratitude for the gift of choice, about the clarity that freedom had brought to his understanding of duty and service. But most powerfully, he had written about choosing to stay not because he had to, but because he wanted to, because he believed their family could modernize and humanize the monarchy in ways that would benefit everyone they served. "This is beautiful," Catherine whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "And it's exactly right. We're not accepting a burden anymore. We're choosing to take on a mission." The reframing of their situation had been crucial to their decision-making process, allowing them to see royal duty as an opportunity rather than an obligation. William took the letter back and sealed it carefully in a new envelope addressed to his father. Tomorrow, he would deliver it in person, finally giving Charles the answer he had been waiting for with such patience and love. But tonight was for them, for celebrating the choice they had made together and the life they would build as a result of that choice. "I want to tell the children," Catherine said suddenly. "Not about Dad's offer, but about our choice to stay, about what it means and why we've made it. I want them to understand that we're here because we want to be, because we believe in what we're doing." The conversation with their children would be crucial, helping them understand their heritage not as a burden, but as an opportunity to make a difference. William nodded, knowing that transparency with their children would be essential to raising them with the kind of healthy relationship to duty that he and Catherine had finally achieved. "We'll tell them together," he agreed, "and we'll keep telling them as often as they need to hear it, that they're loved for who they are, not what they represent." As they prepared for bed, both William and Catherine felt a sense of peace that had been missing from their lives for longer than they cared to admit. The choice had been difficult, but making it consciously and together had transformed their understanding of their roles and their relationship to the institution they would inherit. They were no longer trapped by expectation. They were empowered by choice, and that made all the difference in the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and new opportunities to serve. But tonight, they held each other close, grateful for a father's love that had given them the freedom to choose their destiny, and confident that they had chosen well. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Windsor Castle as William made his way once again to his father's study, his letter of decision carefully tucked in his jacket pocket. This time, however, his steps carried a different energy. Where weeks ago he had walked these corridors with confusion and fear, today he moved with purpose and clarity. The weight he carried was no longer the burden of an impossible choice, but the satisfaction of a decision made with love and conviction. Charles was already waiting, but unlike their previous meetings, he appeared relaxed and genuinely happy. There was something in his father's expression that suggested he already knew what William's decision would be, not because it had been predetermined, but because he understood his son well enough to recognize the direction his heart would ultimately take him. "You look different," Charles observed as William settled into the familiar chair across from his desk. "Lighter somehow, despite the weight of what you've been carrying these past weeks." The transformation in his son was unmistakable, a shift from someone burdened by obligation to someone empowered by choice. William smiled, feeling the truth of his father's observation. "I feel different," he admitted, pulling out his letter. "This process, this gift you gave me, has changed everything about how I understand our family's role and my place in it." He handed the envelope across the desk, watching as his father accepted it with hands that trembled slightly with emotion. Charles opened the letter carefully, his eyes moving slowly across William's words. As he read, his expression shifted through surprise, pride, and finally overwhelming joy. When he finished, he looked up at his son with tears in his eyes, the letter still clutched in his hands like a precious treasure. "You're choosing to stay," Charles said softly, though it wasn't really a question. The certainty in his voice suggested that this outcome had always been his hope, even as he had genuinely offered William the freedom to choose differently. "I'm choosing to serve," William corrected gently, the distinction important to how he now understood his decision. "Not because I have to, but because I want to. Because Catherine and I believe we can use this position to make a real difference in people's lives. And because we want to raise our children to understand service as a privilege rather than a burden." Charles stood up from his desk and walked around to embrace his son, holding him tightly as emotions overcame them both. In that moment, years of unspoken pressure and expectation melted away, replaced by the simple love between a father and son who had found their way to understanding each other completely. "I am so proud of you," Charles whispered, his voice breaking with emotion. "Not because of the choice you made, but because of how you made it. With thought, with love, with consideration for everyone who would be affected. You're going to be an extraordinary king because you truly want to be one." When they finally separated, both men were wiping tears from their eyes, overwhelmed by the significance of the moment. William pulled out a second letter, this one addressed to Catherine, Harry, and the children. "We want to share this decision with the family first," he explained, before making any public announcements. "This choice affects all of us, and everyone deserves to understand our reasoning." Charles nodded approvingly, recognizing the wisdom of keeping family communication open and honest. "And Harry?" he asked, knowing that William's brother's perspective had been crucial to his decision-making process. "Harry understood," William replied. "He said that watching me make this choice freely made him happier than anything that's happened between us in years. He knows that I'm not staying because I'm trapped, but because I'm called to this work." The healing between the brothers that had begun with this conversation would continue to grow, built on mutual respect for the different paths they had chosen. Over the following days, William and Catherine began the process of sharing their decision with family, close friends, and key advisors. Each conversation brought new understanding of how their choice would ripple outward, affecting not just their immediate family, but the entire institution of the monarchy and the people it served. The children took the news with the remarkable adaptability that had always characterized their approach to their unusual lives. George asked thoughtful questions about what it would mean for his future, while Charlotte seemed most interested in how they could help other children through their work. Louis was still too young to fully understand, but he absorbed the love and certainty that surrounded the family's discussions about their future. "We want you to know," Catherine told the children as they sat together in the garden where this journey had begun, "that everything we do as a family is about choice and love. We choose to serve others because we believe it's the right thing to do, and we choose to do it together because family is the most important thing in the world." When they finally announced their decision publicly, the response was overwhelmingly positive. People seemed to respond to the authenticity of a couple who had consciously chosen their path, rather than simply accepting it. The knowledge that William could have walked away but chose to stay gave weight to his commitment in a way that hereditary duty alone never could. Months later, as William reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point, he realized that his father's gift had been about much more than choice itself. It had been about understanding the difference between duty imposed and duty embraced, between service rendered reluctantly and service offered joyfully. The freedom to say no had made his yes infinitely more meaningful. Standing in the same garden where Catherine had once worried about their children's future, William watched George teaching Louis to kick a football while Charlotte created elaborate stories for her dolls. They were still royal children, still different from their peers in many ways. But they were also children who were being raised to understand that their privilege came with responsibility, that their platform was an opportunity to help others, and that their family's commitment to service was a choice made with love rather than an obligation imposed by birth. The tears that had marked the beginning of this journey had been tears of overwhelming confusion and fear, but as William picked up Louis and swung him around the garden, listening to his son's delighted laughter, he realized that the strongest emotion he felt now was gratitude. Gratitude for a father who had loved him enough to offer him freedom, for a wife who had shared the burden of choice, and for a life that had meaning precisely because it had been chosen rather than simply accepted. King Charles's last wish had not been a burden after all. It had been the greatest gift a father could give his son, the knowledge that he was loved unconditionally and the freedom to choose his own path to happiness and service. And William had chosen well.